Hello, this is I Go Travel with Don Barnett. We are talking about the Canadian Arctic. Not just the wonderful things up there, unique country, but how important it is, more than ever, for Canada to pay attention, or they can lose its claim to sovereignty in its Arctic lands. The planet is changing. Climate change is old news now. The North Pole and the Arctic Ocean are melting like never before. Climate change and the melting ice has renewed interest in the Arctic. Canada, since its beginning as a country, has always had an interest in the polar region and feelings of legitimate ownership in the North. We are looking right down on the North Pole. The dark blue is the deeper part of the Arctic Ocean. Look at the extent of the coastline on the north side of the Arctic Ocean. It belongs to Russia, by far the greater length in the area. However, other countries have expressed interest. Finland, Sweden, and Norway over here in the north end of Europe have expressed new interest in the Arctic, as has Iceland and its associate or protectorate, Greenland. Proximity or closeness is not the only criteria on who will eventually control parts of the polar region. Look at the U.S. territory of Alaska on the left side there that appears on the fringe of the immediate polar region. Nevertheless, the U.S. has expressed interest in the area, as has China, who is in a far-off section of the planet. All eyes are on the northern islands and the Arctic Ocean. It is the new frontier. It is one of the last unclaimed regions on planet Earth. And Canada has a vital stake in the Arctic. But now is the time to start to pay attention to it. Either pay attention or lose it. The old adage, use it or lose it, applies to the Arctic today. The Russians have already sent a submarine deep below the Arctic Ocean, right below the North Pole, and planted a Russian flag there. There are about 60 communities across the Canadian Arctic today. Cambridge Bay and Joe Haven, Panguitong, Pond Inlet. There's a whole series of them in what is the region of the islands called Canada's High Arctic. Canada has established 3 military Arctic headquarters to further establish its sovereignty over its Arctic islands. One is in Inuvik, the second one is in Yellowknife, and the third one is in the eastern Arctic in Nunavut in the community of Iqaluit. And each of these Arctic military headquarters are responsible for overseeing Canadian sovereignty over, from Iqaluit, it would look after the area of the Baffin Island and Ellesmere Island and the Eastern Arctic. Yellowknife headquarters would look after Cambridge Bay and the communities and islands of the Central Arctic area. And Inuvik would look after the western side of Canada's Arctic archipelago. I worked in the Arctic when I was a young man, even bought this polar bear skin that was drying against the wall. The main only store was the Hudson Bay store. And the days of the igloos were all gone. These were government housing, and the kids were playing in the school gym. Snowmobiles were starting to replace dogs. For a lot of years and centuries, there has been a search for a passage through the Arctic waters. Already, the Panama Canal is having difficulty accommodating some of the larger modern ships. And that means that these larger ships will have to go back and go around the tip of South America. However, if they can find, with these melting waters of the Arctic, if they can find a passage through, that would be of a considerable interest, moving goods and people between Asia and Europe right through the Polar Sea. Canada has been historically involved in searching for a passage through its northern islands. One of the first ships to make it through was the little police boat called the St. Roche. The Canadian police, the RCMP, have a long history of patrolling Canada's Arctic waters. And the St. Roche made it through the Northwest Passage, or Canada's inland waters, in the early 1940s. In 1940, it went from the west end over to the east Atlantic side. And 4 years later, it returned back from the east to the western side. This map gives us another perspective of the region. Russia supports Canada's claim to sovereignty over its islands in its internal sea, just as the Russians want to claim sovereignty over the islands off of their nearby coastline. The United Nations International Law of the Sea also recognizes Canada's right to sovereignty over its islands in its internal waters. A minority of nations, such as the US and a few European countries, would like to see the polar route through the Canadian archipelago as an uncontrolled international waterway. Canada's position is that it, like the Panama Canal, it may be used as an international passageway, but would be controlled by the home country in the same manner as the International Panama Canal is controlled by Panama, and the International Suez Canal is controlled by Egypt. Both Russia, that owns the largest amount of polar coastline, and the International Law of the Sea support the Canadian position. History clearly shows that making claims of sovereignty without sufficient backup can result in a country losing its sovereignty over what should have been its lands. The British built infrastructure and eventually won the competition for sovereignty over North America. In contrast, the French trapped furs across much of North America, but built little beyond small fur trading posts. The Spanish, in the lower left here, named islands all along the Pacific coast, but the search for gold rather than permanent settlement was their motivation. The Russians searched for sea otter furs and built only isolated outposts along the Pacific coast, never going inland. Like the Spanish, the Russians never went inland, but remained along the narrow coastline. The British built infrastructure. They built homes, agriculture, and industry. And the new British, now called Americans, came in large numbers, also building the essential infrastructure to claim sovereignty over the new land. Academic paperwork and even planting a flag in the ground is not sufficient. Either do what the British did and develop sufficient infrastructure to maintain your northern islands, or you will potentially lose them. Canada has a long history of infrastructure in the Arctic. The Black Line locates the old Cold War radar detection line, once called the DEW Line, the Distance Early Warning Line. The DEW Line has been dismantled for some years now because of more sophisticated technology. I showed this map to make the point that Canada needs to establish outposts along its outer northern edge to show other nations that this is indeed Canadian territory. To this end, the long black line with an arrow shows the location of Kootenay-Puck National Park on the north end of Ellesmere Island, another signal to other nations that this is Canadian Inuit territory. Currently, over 50 Canadian Inuit communities have been established across the Arctic Islands. Many have changed from their original English names to Canadian Inuit or Inuktitut names. Another signal that, again, this is Canadian territory. Canada needs to take a page out of the American playbook. Did you know when the Americans bought Alaska, they built 44 communities that they called forts? Now, some of these forts were hardly any more than wooden outhouses, long since been destroyed by the wind and the rain. However, it sent a message to everyone that this is a fortified land and it is American territory. Again, Canada needs to take a page out of that playbook. Building infrastructure is the key to Canada maintaining sovereignty over its Arctic lands. It has done some things that are very good and effective. They have developed and supported local Inuit communities in terms of education and medical and supplies and opportunities for self-government for local communities. Canada has established with Denmark and the Greenland the boundary between the two nations through Nares Strait. The one-time dispute over a small island in the strait has been settled by both countries according to international agreement. Canada has built in the northeast corner of Ellesmere Island a military base there. Again, a message that this is Canadian territory. In the same region is the new national park in Canada, the Kootenay-Puck National Park. There are other things that need to be done because history has shown if you don't do and build infrastructure, you can lose what was once yours. We need more military outposts, not big expensive things, but they need to have runways and the Canadian flag over more islands in the Arctic. Continual, ongoing military surveillance needs to be established. Too often the Canadian military won't even fight fires on federal land in the country, but they need to be called upon by politicians to increase ongoing military surveillance in the north. We need to build more outposts and, in effect, lighthouses, whatever you call them, along the Northwest Passage routes that are melting and seeing more international traffic. We need to have more mining sites in the north. They don't have to be great, expensive, huge mines, but mining is part of the infrastructure. We need to increase the already ongoing research, small research programs. We need to build more national parks and regional parks in Nunavut and in the Western Arctic. And we need to do what Iceland and Greenland are doing, and that is bring in more tourism people to see and realize that the Canadian Arctic, these islands in the archipelago, are indeed owned by Canada. There's about one thing left to do, and that is for you to send this video along with a letter to federal politicians, every one of them, and to the Prime Minister. And sometimes politicians need a boot to save their own country. And in the meantime, we are rolling down the road. Hit the subscribe button. That'll tell you when this and other videos will be posted on the internet. We'll see you at the next stop. So long for now. This is I Go Travel with Don Barnett. If you want to see more videos as we roll around the countryside, do what it does. It says there on the bottom, just Google, start with a little @ sign, @Don Barnett 5090. Click on my name first, and then hit the word playlists in the middle of the page and scroll down. Each playlist contains several travel videos.